All right, Maria, you are in the cone of silence.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I
All
can.
right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if everybody's ready. Cool. Slideshow to start. Okay, great. So this morning we're going to talk about ships and shipping in the 19th century. And we're going to be doing kind of a big, broad sort of history. We'll touch on ship design, a little bit on crew, a little bit on cargo, a little bit on whaling. So if you have questions about anything specific or you're looking for more information, you know, at the end of the presentation, feel free to ask, and I'm sure Eric or myself can direct you to some more in-depth resources. So start off, this is a lovely picture of a ship that a number of you might recognize. That's the Joseph Conrad under sail. And we'll just talk really briefly first about like why are we specifically talking about the 19th century. So most of you have been on and around our campus. You'll notice that a lot of our historic buildings and ships do date from the 19th century. They kind of run the gamut from the Buckingham Hall House, which is set up to represent the 1830s, all the way up through, you know, like Stone Store, which is closer to the 1880s, 1890s. So we're usually talking about the mid to late 19th century, but we sort of talk about it as a whole. And of course, we do have ships and buildings that date from post 19th century. And if you ever find yourself interpreting one of them, like the LA Denton, you're obviously going to talk a little bit differently about that particular vessel's time period. During the 19th century, maritime trade was shaped by the social and economic forces of the time. American deepwater trade, shipbuilding, and whaling all see a peak roughly around mid-century, 1850s, 1860s, followed by a sort of a long decline that tapers off in the early 20th century. The town of Mystic, where Mystic Seaport is, and the grounds were actually a shipyard. Mystic was primarily a shipbuilding port, and Mystic shipbuilding follows a very similar arc with a peak around the 1860s and then sort of a slow decline all the way off into the 1890s, very last ships being built in the 1920s, actually. So just briefly talking about the history of sail power, sailing vessels, we're mostly going to be talking about the European tradition, but it's important to remember that cultures around the world have used sail power to great advantage, particularly pointing out, like, for example, the Polynesians who traveled thousands of miles navigating without what we would consider sort of modern navigational technology and colonized islands all across the Pacific Ocean. So it's important to always bear that in mind when we talk about maritime history. We usually talk about the European and the North American tradition, but there are many, many different cultures that have many different approaches to sail power and trade. So speaking of the sort of European tradition, on the left, you'll see a reproduction of a voyaging canoe. But on the right, you'll see Victoria, which is a Spanish carrack, the type of vessel built in the 14th and 15th centuries. And this is the first European vessel to successfully navigate the globe. And European sail technology really sort of takes off in the 15th and 16th centuries, which is what we usually call the age of exploration. Larger vessels allow Europeans to travel farther and farther distances, and they're also aided by improvements in navigational technology, which help them to understand their location relative to everything else. So then we're going to jump ahead to the 18th century. So sort of leading up to the time period that we often talk about, the 18th century is basically a long stretch of near continual warfare between European nations. It also includes the growth of the North American colonies, the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary War, and a lot of historians will include the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812 into something they call the long 18th century, which is basically just tacking on those extra 15 years because sort of culturally and socially and politically, 1815 is where you sort of see the end of this political scenario where we have constant warfare here. So you'll often hear that term, the long 18th century. And this state of near constant warfare has an effect on the shipping industry. So ships were built to sail either heavily armed to defend from enemy vessels, or they were often organized into convoys. So convoys were, many cargo ships would be escorted by a handful of naval vessels in an attempt to protect them from enemy vessels. Privateering is not uncommon. Privateering, just for those who might not be super familiar, is basically a legalized form of economic warfare. So a captain or crew would get letters of marque, which gave them permission to attack enemy vessels only. So it was meant to basically hurt your enemy by attacking their trade directly. It sees a peak in popularity during the American Revolution and then pretty much drops off after 1815 for a long time. And that's one of the things you'll find that a lot of visitors are very disappointed about when they, want to know, is the Morgan a pirate ship? Were there pirates? Were there privateers? And unfortunately for them, the answer is usually no, unless you're talking about the American Civil War, where some Southern privateers did prey on whale ships, but no pirates, sadly. And then here in the United States, there was not a large naval force really in the first 50 years after independence. And so we tend to rely more on small, fast ships to evade blockades. Small is also important because if you think your vessel might be captured, putting a lot of capital in one place is a lot like putting all your eggs in one basket. If something happens to them, you're going to lose a lot as opposed to a little bit. So that's sort of more the American response to this time frame. So after 1815, Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, and we get this very long stretch of peace between Europe and North America. And this results in changes in ship design and crew sizes. So by the 1830s and 40s, sailing ships are sailing with fewer and fewer crew members because they don't have to sail armed anymore. So that's really important because also at the same time, the ships are getting larger. So you're getting bigger and bigger vessels that are being sailed by fewer and fewer people. Of course, you have to pay your crew, so it's advantageous for the owners to pay as few people as they need to make their vessel, operate. And it also leads to changes in labor. Previously, you had sometimes hundreds of people on a vessel the size, only a little bit bigger than the Charles W. Morgan, meant that you could throw a lot more manpower at things like raising sails or raising an anchor. When you reduce those crew sizes, people have to find clever workarounds. So if you've come to the museum and you've ever heard sea shanties, they develop and evolve around this time period because it's a way to coordinate work so that fewer people can put all their effort into one thing to do the same work that maybe 20 people would have done with maybe 8 to 10 people. And then the last bullet here is just form follows function. So we're talking about general trends in shipping, but it is always good to remember that vessels are always built to suit a particular purpose. And so even if we're talking about deep water cargo ships following a certain trend in the economy, it doesn't necessarily follow that a coasting schooner is going to follow in the same way. So all these vessels are built for a specific purpose, and that's almost always going to determine what they look like and why, as opposed to these bigger trends that are happening. So here we have two vessels as a little bit of a comparison, and and I'm going to see if I can unmute you all. I guess I can't. Eric, can you unmute people?
Yes, I will do so right now. Just bear with me here.
No. I think you all can unmute yourselves too if you can just find the little button and click it.
Yeah.
There we go. So these are two ships that were built a little over 60 years apart from each other. And they both sail out to the West Coast, one in the 18th and one in the 19th century. So we have some stats here just to kind of show the difference. So Lady Washington, this is a replica. The original doesn't exist anymore, but this is the replica. Lady Washington is 87 feet length overall, which includes spars and all of that. And she is about 99 tons. So tonnage in sailing ship cargo lingo basically means the volume of cargo. It's typically beam or width of the vessel times the depth of the hold and the length of the hull. It changes over time, so it's hard to get an apples to apples comparison as tonnage laws shift, but it's a relatively good benchmark. On the right, we have Young America, built in 1853 by William Webb in New York, also sailing out to California. The Young America is 243 feet and has a tonnage of just shy of 1,500. So looking at these pictures, I just wanted to let you guys have a chance to kind of comment on any differences that you might see between these two ships.
They're different sailing rigs.
They are different sailing rigs. Yep, that is a good point. By 1853, we can see the masts are much taller. Young America also has 3 masts instead of 2.
Lady Washington, you say, was served as a privateer, I mean, military, as well as a merchant ship, whereas the Young America's strictly commercial.
Yeah, so Lady Washington would have carried some form of weaponry, probably small cannons. Young America wouldn't have carried any weaponry, with possibly the exception of a captain having a set of pistols on board. So that's a big difference. Anything else? There's no right or wrong answer. I mean, there are right and wrong answers here, but there's a lot of things you can comment on for sure.
Oh, one would think that Young America is a much faster ship in general.
That's actually really interesting. Yeah, so Young America is a pretty fast ship. She's actually what we call a clipper ship. And it's sometimes a little hard to tell in this picture, but Lady Washington, you can see, is kind of rounded in the hull, which is very common design pre-1830, 1840, whereas Young America, being bigger, is faster, but also has sort of a much narrower, lower, less rounded hull. So that's a big change in design as well. Right. No one else has any other?
Well, Young America seems like it has much more tonnage. So it was just built to just carry a lot of stuff.
Yes, it was. Yeah, exactly. So you can put more things in one vessel. It's safe to do that because you're less worried about losing that ship. But also it's a reflection of the economy, right? And the fact that you can ship more goods and still make a pretty good profit. All right, fantastic. So just a good thing to just keep in mind when you think about how rapidly vessels sort of evolve in this time period.
All right, Maria, I'm going to remute everyone.
Sounds
So
good.
just make sure you unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. So here are some a list of dates. It's not super important to remember these exactly, but it's good to have a sense of kind of how this change comes about. So a variety of factors lead to the increase in shipping tonnage in the United States. First bullet here is 1840s, 1830s and 40s, really, the demand for whale oil. So we'll talk about whaling a little bit because many of you will be on the Morgan. But the demand for whale oil for industrial machinery pushes oil prices up to their highest point. And so that spurs increased construction and outfitting of whale ships to go out to the Pacific. In 1844, we have Cushing's Treaty, which opens Shanghai and other treaty ports to American trade. This is also really big because for a long time, American ships couldn't really legally trade directly with China. So this creates a sort of boom in vessels being outfitted for the Far East. 1845 to 47, we have Congress subsidizing American steamship lines. Those are usually steamship lines going across the Atlantic, but some of them are also going to Panama for people to then ship things across the isthmus over to the West Coast. 1848, we have the discovery of gold in California. This is probably one of the biggest ships in American shipping. It spurs the construction of clipper ships for the most part. And that is followed shortly by the discovery of gold in Australia. It also creates a sort of mass immigration from the American East Coast over to the West Coast for people in search of gold. And then later for people who are building the economy in cities that support that. And then in 1850, we have Maury's published collection of wind and current charts, which sometimes compared to the rest of this list doesn't seem as important. But the fact that all of this information was now collected in one source meant that captains were able to plan routes much, much more efficiently. So you'll see at the end of this that your average trip from England to Australia, for example, drops from 125 days to 92 days. That's very significant in terms of trade. That's nearly a month's time that's been shaved off your trip. Long passages still happen, adverse weather still happens, but on the whole, travel between points, even incredibly long distances, is shortened pretty significantly after 1850. And then ultimately, there's no one moment that can be pinpointed as the turning point, but just for comparison purposes, by 1850, U.S. shipping tonnage is almost 3 times greater than it was in 1830. So now we're going to jump a little bit into sail design and technology, just to kind of talk about how you identify vessels in the 19th century and what went into those design considerations. So we have 2 listed here: function, which we touched on before. So most vessels are designed to perform a specific function, and that will almost always dictate what type of vessel is built. And then second, we have the rig. So there are, generally speaking, 2 types of sailing vessels in the 19th century. We call them square riggers or fore and aft riggers. That's a really broad generalization, but it's a really good place to start. So we'll go to the next slide. So square sails. So common misconception is that square sails are square in shape. And you can definitely see from this picture that that sail is in no way square. It is 4-sided, but it's not square. The name actually comes from the relationship of the yard, which you can see at the top of the sail is that wooden spar that the sail is actually attached to. The yard there is perpendicular or square to the keel. So that's where that name comes from. And you can see on the right that sort of illustration. The keel runs from the bow to the stern of the ship, and the yard is at a 90-degree angle to that. And then we have fore and aft sails. This is what we see most commonly on sailing vessels today. So fore and aft sails run from the fore or the front to the aft or the back of the boat. They also could be called parallel to the keel when they're at rest. They are often, but not always, attached to spars called a boom and a gaff. So in this picture, you can see on the bottom of the sail is the boom, on the top of the sail is the gaff. But you can also see forward there are 2 fore and aft head sails, those little, they're basically a jib and a flying jib, but they're not attached to a boom or a gaff. And those are still considered fore and aft sails because they run fore to aft. So sometimes, not always. And then both square sails and fore and aft sails get maneuvered out of their at-rest position. So when you're sailing a vessel, they're not always going to be parallel or perpendicular to a keel. They're only like that when they're not being used, essentially, or when they've been put away for the end of the sail. And many vessels in the 19th century carry a combination. So by the 19th century, it would be very, very unusual to see a vessel that only carried square sails. That's just not really how vessels were rigged at this time. So on the right, you can see the Charles W. Morgan, which is an example of a vessel that carries both square sails and fore and aft sails. Or sorry, on the right is Joseph Conrad, on the left is the Morgan. So on the right, you see Joseph Conrad, same thing, fore and aft and square sails. The L.A. Dunton, a little bit different. She only carries fore and aft sails. That was more common, not uncommon at all to see a vessel that only carries fore and aft sails. So then what is a ship? So a ship is a term that we throw out pretty regularly here at Mystic Seaport. We call the Charles W. Morgan a whale ship. And that's totally fine to say, but technically speaking, she's not a ship today. So a ship is defined as a vessel that has at least 3 masts and carries square sails on all 3 of those masts. So today a ship is something of a certain tonnage, it's a certain size vessel, but that is very different from a 19th century definition. So even a very small vessel, like for example, the Joseph Conrad, which is only about 100 feet long, is still a ship because of her rig, not because of her size. And you can see the silhouette here is just kind of a basic example of what a ship rig actually looks like. So the only ship that we have rigged at Mystic Seaport today is the Joseph Conrad. If you look over at the Conrad today, you will notice that she doesn't have square sails on all of her masts, and that is because most of her rigging is down for maintenance. But if you look at a photo of her when she's fully rigged, you'll see 3 masts and yards on all of those masts. The Morgan was originally ship rigged when she was first built, but was cut down to a bark, which was pretty common for whale ships in the mid to late 19th century. So you can see on the Morgan that she has the foremast, the one in the front has square sails on it. The main mast in the middle has square sails on it. But if you look at her mizzen mast, you'll notice that there are no square sails there. There's only fore and aft sails. So that's what defines a bark. And you could have a vessel with 5 masts. And as long as that last mast didn't have square sails on it, you'd still call it a bark. On the left is the Benjamin F. Packard. There's a ship built in 1883. Mystic Seaport has the cabin preserved on the 2nd floor of the Stillman building. But you'll see on the Benjamin F. Packard that there are square sails on the fore, squares on the main, and squares on the mizzen. So you can kind of see that difference there. The reason the Morgan is not rigged back to her original configuration is because at Mystic Seaport, we try to restore our ships to the earliest photographic record that we have. And so the earliest photographic record of the Morgan has her rigged as a bark. And we could have re-rigged her as a ship. She was ship rigged when she came to the museum. But the only sources we have are drawings, paintings, or someone's description. And that's not nearly as informative as an actual photograph. So I'll pause there for a second. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself now, and we can talk about it.
Why was the Morgan re-rigged as a bark?
Well, the main reason was manpower, crew. So bark rigged vessels have fewer sails, so they're a little bit easier to manage, but you don't lose a whole lot in terms of speed. So as it became harder and harder to find crew and maintain these vessels, cutting it down to a bark rig meant that you had a little bit less maintenance, a little bit less work to do, but you didn't lose a lot of speed. And particularly in whaling, speed is not paramount. So not being able to sail around Cape Horn quite as quickly as you would have been is not going to hurt your income as much as if you were, say, a clipper ship carrying product out to California. Yeah, that's a good question.
I assume the square sails can be trimmed from the deck, but if they're furled or unfurled, someone has to climb up to each yard, right, to do that?
Yep, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but yes, that's another good point, is that anytime you want to set or furl these sails, your crew has to go up aloft to do it. They are trimmed from the deck using lines called braces, and braces pivot the yard and the sail around. But that also actually is pretty labor intensive because you have to trim all the sails at once. And so if you're looking at the main mast, that's 5 sets of braces that you have to be able to put crew on, basically.
And can square sails and compared to fore and aft, do they point into the wind equally well?
They don't. We are actually also going to get to that too. So we'll start scrolling through the rest of the presentation here. So jumping on, schooners, fore and aft rigs. So we have a few schooners here at Mystic Seaport. A schooner is a vessel with 2 or more masts that carry fore and aft sails on all their masts. I put in the difference between a ketch and a yawl because I think that's a very common question that comes up. Ketches and yawls are still reasonably common in and around Long Island Sound, so you'll probably end up seeing one on the river, if not many. And the difference is, you can see in this picture, the schooner masts are all the same height, or the aftmost mast in the back is taller than the one in the front. A ketch or a yawl, the mizzen mast in the back is much smaller, and so you can usually tell pretty quickly whether it's a schooner or a ketch or a yawl. A ketch, the mast is in front of the steering column, and a yawl, it's behind. That's not super important to know. But if you were curious, that's the difference. And then a schooner with 2 masts is simply referred to as a schooner. But once you add more masts, it's referred to by the number of masts it has. So you'll hear 3, 5, 6, and there was actually one 7-masted schooner built in the United States in 1902. It was not very efficient and didn't do super well in its chosen trade, but it did exist. It was the Thomas W. Lawson. And schooners are typically found in coastal sailing or fishing in the 19th century. They're also highly efficient. So some of the last large wooden sailing vessels that were built in the United States are coasting schooners that were designed to carry coal up and down the East Coast, because coal was a really cheap cargo and these were really cheap boats to run because they didn't require a lot of crew. So here we have a few examples of schooners. On the left is that weird 7-masted schooner, the Thomas W. Lawson. There's a lot of debate about the names for all of those masts. I don't know them all off the top of my head, but it's fun to look them up if you ever get the chance. In the middle, you'll see Amistad, which is at Mystic Seaport today. Amistad's a little different in that she does carry that one square sail, which actually makes her a topsail schooner. But because her 2 main sails on her fore and her main mast are fore and aft, she's still called a schooner. And then on the right, you'll see Schooner Brilliant. If you've worked in the Collins Gallery, you will have seen that Brilliant's tender, Afterglow, is being restored. Schooner Brilliant is our sail training vessel, and she's really interesting because she carries both a gaff rig on her fore and a Bermuda rig on her main. So schooners can carry both types of sails. It doesn't really matter, the big triangular sails or the gaff rig sails.
Maria, can you, just a follow-up question on your previous slide, you mentioned that one of the advantages of schooners is that they're really efficient. Can you just say a little bit more about that, why that is the case?
Yeah, so especially these big ones like the Thomas W. Lawson over here, you know, you can imagine it with maybe 4 or 5 masts looking a little bit less silly over here, but they have fairly large sail area, and all of those sails can be set from the deck. So you don't have to send crew up into the rigging. You also, by the late 19th, early 20th century, might have something called a donkey engine on board, which was like a small auxiliary engine to help you with heavy lifting. So you could even raise some of those sails with almost no manpower, with just somebody who can turn the engine on, get it started, and then raise that sail up.
I see.
So they don't require a lot of crew, and you can also see how big they are. The largest wooden sailing vessel built in the United States was the Wyoming, and she was built in Bath, Maine, and I believe she was a 6-masted schooner. And that was the biggest wooden vessel ever built in the United States. So could carry a lot of cargo.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then finally, we just have sloops and cutters. So a sloop is just a 1-masted vessel. So most of the sort of private sailing boats that you're going to see up and down the Mystic River are sloops. If it has 2 headsails, it might be called a cutter. And these are really common today because they can be sailed by few people. You know, obviously a really big one's going to require more crew members, but your little 15-foot dinghy that you're going to see on the river can be sailed with 1 to 2 people, and even larger vessels can be sailed with 2 to 3 people at a time, which is great because most of us don't have 15 of our closest friends to take out a larger ship. And so touching a little bit on the questions that have come up, why a ship, a schooner, or a sloop? So crew size. One of the disadvantages to these big square riggers is that you do have to send crew aloft to furl or set the sails. So you can see in this picture, this is the Joseph Conrad's topsail. The Joseph Conrad is about 100 feet long. Compared to a cargo vessel built at the time, she's very small. So your average cargo ship in the 1880s would have been 250 to possibly 280 feet long. So you can imagine how much bigger those sails would be. And you can see that there's 6 people here furling the Joseph Conrad sail. So just think about how many crew you would need for a vessel more than 2 times the size of the Joseph Conrad. Alternately, fore and aft sails can usually be set from the deck, so you don't have to have this huge number of people up in the rigging every time you want to set a sail. Maneuverability. So talking about pointing, referring to how close a vessel can get to the direction of the wind. As a general rule, no sailing ship can sail right into the wind. It would just go backwards. But square riggers tend to be more limited in their ability to sail close to the wind. So they are often designed for long ocean-going passages where you can see these winds tend to blow in the same direction pretty regularly. So that meant that they could set all their sails and plan their route in a way that would be most efficient for them. I think a great example is if you look at this picture, the North Atlantic, trying to sail directly from Europe to North America, you're sailing pretty much right into those westerly winds. And so you're going to fight them the entire way across. Famously, the original Mayflower tried to do just that, and they had an incredibly long passage across the Atlantic. As more and more vessels started to make that passage, captains learned that if they sailed south, where you can see the winds would carry them across the more southern part of the Atlantic, and then they would sail up the coast, that was actually more efficient than trying to sail straight across. So that's a path you'll often see on ships' charts, so that they'll go south, hit North America, somewhere around the Carolinas, and then come up the coast to New York. Fore and aft rig vessels, on the other hand, can point closer to the wind, so they tend to be able to maneuver more depending on the wind shifts. And they are really great in and around the coast because wind around the coast does not blow from one consistent direction. It tends to shift. Here in the Mystic River in the summer, we almost always start the morning with a northerly, and then it shifts around to the south by about 10 o'clock in the morning. So having a vessel that can maneuver more is really advantageous when you're not going to have a regular wind direction. And then here's just a little diagram of how vessels can sail in relation to the wind. So that sort of pink triangle at the top is what I often call the no-go zone. So you can't sail. So if you point your boat that way, you're not going to go anywhere. But fore and aft vessels can sail sort of in that close hauled or close reach position. Big square rigger might be able to get close to a close reach, but really you're talking beam reach at best for most of the time. So you can see that if the wind was coming from the south and you wanted to go south, it's going to be really, really hard to get there in a square rigger. And then finally, efficiency. So we've talked the negatives of square riggers and that they require a lot of crew and they're not as maneuverable, but you can see how many sails they can set. So that large amount of canvas means that they are very efficient when it comes to moving those big heavy hulls and cargo through the water. So if you're taking cargo across the ocean, you want to take a square rigger because it's going to be quicker and faster and you're going to move much more cargo. And then finally, just sort of cargo, what a vessel is carrying will also have an effect on the design. So if you are carrying something perishable or something that is advantageous to get it there faster, you're probably going to put it in a vessel like a clipper ship that we saw earlier with lots of sails so it can go a lot faster, as opposed to maybe like a whale ship like the Morgan, which is generally going to move slower and not get there as quickly. All right, so we'll pause there again if anybody has any questions before we move on. Nope. Okay. So then steam. We don't talk a whole lot about steam. Well, we do at Engine Weekend and if you're on Sabino, but normally the vessels we're stationed on are sail powered. But you know, steam and sail coexist for most of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Early steam powered vessels had very high construction costs and very high operating costs, which meant that they were not very efficient. And so they didn't replace sailing vessels very, immediately. Most steam-powered ships covered short passenger routes, mail routes, or maybe small shipping routes that were close to shore, inland, something that maybe hadn't even existed before, like small ferries that would take you from here to, say, Block Island, would have been an ideal route for an early steamship. And then sail technology continues to evolve. So a lot of times people think like steam came about and then sail technology just stops evolving. But sail technology continues to evolve all the way up to the 20th century. And a lot of historians consider the sailing vessels of the 1880s and 1890s to be some of the most efficient sailing vessels that were ever built. And part of that is because they are now competing with steam. So the evolution tries to make them competitive. They're trying to make those sailing vessels as competitive as possible, even with steam vessels. So a few key dates. Early steam vessels have paddle wheels. You've probably seen paddle wheel steamers. By the 1830s, the screw propeller starts to replace that. The screw propeller is a lot more efficient. By the 1840s, you have regular passages between the United States and France by steamship. By 1842 to 47, we have the steamship Driver. It's the first one to circumnavigate the globe. It does do it mostly under sail power, but it was a steamship technically. In 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal makes a big difference because sailing vessels typically can't travel through the Suez, but steamships can. So if you're sailing from Europe out to China, for example, all of a sudden steamships have a great advantage in that they can cut through the Suez Canal instead of going all the way around. By 1870, the compound cylinder reduces the amount of fuel by 60%. So not having to carry, only carrying 40% of what you would have previously had means that you have more space for cargo and you're paying less for fuel. So that was a big deal. Anti-fouling paint is developed for iron ships. So most steam vessels built after the 1850s and 60s are usually iron because they hold up better to the vibrations created by the steam engine. But they didn't have a way to keep those vessels from fouling, from having things grow on the bottom. Wooden ships would have copper sheathing put on them, but you can't put copper on iron because they react. So there's a lot of newspaper articles in the 1850s and 60s about steamships that are overdue in port by 2 and 3 weeks. And it's all attributed to the fact that the bottom is so fouled up that they're going 2 to 3 knots slower than they would normally go. 1881, the SS Aberdeen is launched with the triple expansion steam engine. The triple expansion engine is going to become the primary form of marine propulsion until the diesel engine is developed in the 1930s. So diesel engines exist prior to the 1930s, but they're not really safe or efficient until the 1930s. So that's why we say they're developed then. But the triple expansion engine is really what makes steam power viable on long voyages. And then in 1914 is the opening of the Panama Canal. Again, that allows steamships to cut right through the Isthmus of Panama rather than sailing down around the tip of South America and Cape Horn. And then here we just have 2 pictures. I apologize, they are a little bit blurry. But on the left, you can see this is basically the anatomy of a steam engine. This is how they work. And on the right, you can see an actual steam engine that is here at Mystic Seaport. So if you walk down into Shipyard right next to the Thames Keel exhibit, you can see this particular engine. So you can see how big they were and what they look like in real life. And then the decline in US shipping and shipbuilding. So by the American Civil War, there's a depression in shipping that has been around for a few years, 1856, and Civil War cuts off trade to the south. Privateering from Southern raiders increases insurance costs, and a lot of American ship owners sell off their ships to foreign owners because it's just not worth it for them to pay the high prices for shipping. After the war, instead of trying to rebuild the merchant fleet, many American investors invest in rail and the interior of the country. So they're working on developing California, the Midwest, that area. So the focus really shifts and the capital shifts to that. And then foreign competition often outcompetes attempts of American shipbuilders to kind of reestablish themselves. British steam is cheaper to build. They also have iron and steel vessels that they can produce at a much lower cost. And so they come to dominate many of the deep water trades. Shipbuilding does continue up through the 20th century here in the United States, but it does not reach the sort of high levels seen in the 1850s and 60s until the outbreak of World War I. In New England, most shipbuilding moves north to Maine. So Mystic becomes more of a manufacturing town. There's a velvet dyeing mill here. But shipbuilding itself really just dies out. There's a little bit, there's military construction in Groton, and then there is a small shipyard at the end of the point in Noank, but otherwise it's just not really a major industry anymore. American whaling also sees a decline after the Civil War. In 1871 and 1876, there are 2 Arctic whaling disasters where 32 whaling ships are wrecked in 1871 and another 12 are wrecked in 1876. They never really rebuild, and so the last whaling ships kind of continue to whale until they're worn out, and again are not replaced. And at the same time, a lot of European investors are building new types of whaling ships. So it's always important on the Morgan, if you're there, to point out that whaling doesn't necessarily end in the 1920s when American whaling ends. It actually only accelerates. But it accelerates because there are modern vessels with engines and deck-mounted guns and technology that can basically pull an entire whale out of the water. So it allows them to hunt a wider variety of whales than just the right whale, the bowhead, and the sperm whale that American whale ships were going after. And then finally, we come to containerization. So this is how most cargo is moved today. It's a form of intermodal transportation. It was developed in the 1950s and 60s. Malcolm McLean is usually the man credited with popularizing the modern form of containerization. He was not the first person to think of it, but he did develop the shipping container that was sturdy and lightweight enough to be easily moved from truck to ship and ship to truck and back again. He was originally a trucker and actually came up with the idea, so the story goes, that he was sitting in port watching all this cargo be unloaded from a ship and then repacked and then moved into a truck, and said, well, wouldn't it be great if I could just move my actual truck onto the ship and then move my ship back off the truck instead of unloading it and loading it every time. In 1956, his first container ship, which was a converted oil tanker, departed Newark, New Jersey. The Ideal X was the name of the vessel. And he heavily invested in the infrastructure to convert not just ships, but port facilities to have the big cranes that could move these containers. The earlier attempts to establish this type of container date back to the 1920s, but none of them were particularly successful. And then here we have 2 pictures of a container ship. On the bottom is the exact same type of tanker that Malcolm McLean converted to be his first container ship. And on the top left is a modern container ship, the Maersk Line. So in the 20 years that follow, the average cargo capacity of ships increased from 15,000 to 60,000 tons. Today, it is significantly more than that. Transportation costs decrease because you have better economies of scale. You have more efficient vessels that move this cargo around, and the loading and unloading time is cut to a fraction of what it used to be. Large cargo ships that are using break bulk cargo, where you're unpacking each individual item and then repacking it, could be in port for weeks. And if you ever get a chance to look at some of the time-lapse photography of container ships today, you can see that they can load and unload some of these vessels in less than 24 hours. Longshoremen become virtually obsolete at this time. Containerization means that you only need a handful of crane operators. So thousands and thousands of people essentially lose their jobs during this transition. And the harbors change as well, because you don't want to bring your ship into a port that can't accommodate your containers. So they become centralized, and you have many small ports kind of become just one big port. That's the Deepwater Harbor that also has the infrastructure to move the containers. It also decreases pilferage and breakage. So things go missing less when you lock them into a giant box. But today, if you do lose something, it's usually the entire container that will just go overboard. And then finally, the changes in shipping lead to changes in manufacturing. So we often hear the lament that everything is made overseas today. Containerization is really what made that possible, because it meant that shipping costs are so cheap that it's still cheaper to make something in, say, China or India, or where labor costs are cheap, and then ship it to your final market than it is to actually make something in the United States. So that's really sort of bringing it up to the present day. Eric, if you want to unmute everyone.
Just a sec. Okay.
Great. So this kind of brings us to the last slide. You know, we talked a lot about the history of 19th century shipping and why we have the different vessels that we have today. But I think an important question is, you know, why do we then preserve these ships? We think of them often as being these very romantic, very kind of beautiful relics of the past. But to somebody living in the 19th century, they probably were a lot like container ships are to us today. And I don't often hear many people arguing to put a container ship in a museum. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, and I will stop sharing so we can all see each other.
Well, one of the reasons, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why they're interesting, but one is simply how beautiful they are and examples of American craftsmanship in a lot of different ways, and rigging and woodwork and the metal work and cooperage and other technologies. So they're just beautiful works of art, some of these older sailing ships, and aesthetically people still appreciate that.
Yeah, it is interesting. A lot of 19th century writers do talk about how beautiful sailing ships are, even when they are the most common form of transportation. So it is an interesting, and again, I don't hear many people say that about modern container ships, but it is interesting how we react to them sort of aesthetically as opposed to thinking of them in their functional manner.
I also think we tend to romanticize the past just in general. We always think that things were better before or they will be better after the time that we're living in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's always an important balance to strike when you talk about ships and shipping in the 19th century is that, yes, these are beautiful ships, but the reality of the people who lived and worked on them is really not very romantic at all.
No.
It was pretty brutal and very, very difficult. So always kind of bringing it back to that human experience and the fact that, yes, this is a beautiful vessel, but also, you know,
It served a function. And
exactly. Yeah. And I'd say you don't normally have to, like, you don't have to disabuse people of their notion
Right.
that it is a lovely historic vessel, because it is, but sort of mixing that with the understanding that it was a functional piece of equipment, essentially, as well.
I think part of it is comparison of the technology of the day, the craftsmanship necessary of the day, and how, in a sense, advanced in their techniques were that contributed to the development of new technologies today. And the other thing is the comparison between the beauty of the ships and the hardships that the crews went through, and the ships went through to do their business. And one thing I was wondering about was a ship like a whaler was a real work ship. But I get the impression that the packet ships that were more cargo and passenger ships weren't as hard to sail or as hard on the crews as the whalers were.
So I would say that they were harder in different ways. Whale ships, you know, if you're a whaleman, you're encountering the dangers of the whale hunt, which is something that no other sailor would really experience on another type of vessel. Packet ships and clipper ships as well tended to rely on speed, and so they were sailed much harder. The crews tended to be pushed harder, and emphasis was on speed and reliability. So while you might not be lowering after whale on a packet ship, you would probably be up in the rigging doing a lot more of that work and carrying more sail in bad weather than you would be if you were on a whale ship.
Maria, can we just clarify for those who may not be familiar with the term when we say a packet, what we're referring to?
So packet ships were vessels, the first vessels that sailed on a schedule. It was kind of a novel idea. The first packet line was in 1818, the Black Ball Line. And they were primarily sailing at first across the Atlantic. And they would be advertised as sailing on a specific day. And you could basically guarantee that whatever you were shipping would leave on a certain date and arrive within a certain time period. And packet ships then expand to not only the rest of Europe, but also they had packets down to South America and packets down to the southern United States, and then eventually packets out to the West Coast. I guess the alternate is that most other vessels didn't sail at a regular date. They would sit at the wharf until the owners felt they had enough cargo or passengers, and then they would go. Which is kind of a hard concept for us today, when we expect everything to be delivered in like 3 days from across the country.
Well, I enjoy seeing the vessels because I'm pretty much of a visual person, and I have trouble understanding how this computer works. But if I look at a sailing vessel and I begin to understand the technology that goes into making them work, it's the same. I have an antique apple peeler, and my grandchildren enjoy turning the wheels and watching the gears. It's just it's a very visual experience, and you see how talented our ancestors were in doing a lot of these things in the machining, and it's just very heartwarming and enjoyable.
Yeah, and I think emphasizing, how much a ship is actually a piece of technology is always a really interesting way to talk about it. Because it's not just the ship and the sails, it's the physics of how sails work. It's the technology that goes into making the canvas that will hold up to the wind, the rope that will be strong enough and will last for a long voyage, being able to pack and process the food so that you can take it with you for 6 months and still eat. So I think that's also a really interesting way to sort of think about it.
And the ship is somehow more comprehensible. I mean, agreeing with the comment, I mean, I'll never quite understand how the chip is designed and how that works inside of the computer, but because of all the things that we have at Mystic Seaport, you can better understand the building blocks that go into creating a ship.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well,
Oh,
they're also sort of time machines, right? It's a chance to revisit the 19th century in a way. I suppose visiting a historical house, but the ships give us a chance to step back in time.
Yeah, and I also think that even though ships and schooners and sloops and et cetera all made plenty of short trips, there's this overriding kind of image in a lot of the public's mind that a ship symbolizes a long journey to some faraway place. And I think that's an idea that kind of withstands time. That the idea of traveling off to far off places is something that has always kind of piqued people's curiosity and imagination. And I think that is also a key aspect of the inherent magnetism of the image of a vessel like the Morgan at the pier.
Also, the Morgan, whaling served a function in the United States with people, providing lighting for their homes, etc. There was a cost per barrel. There's a parallel in the current, and then eventually other technologies took over. There's an exact parallel happening with petroleum. It's a cost per barrel industry. There's people that got rich on it, but it's starting to get to a certain point in its life where there's alternative energy technologies that are coming out with solar and wind and other things. So from that standpoint, that industry represented by the Morgan and the rest of the exhibits at the seaport, are sort of a look into, hey, this is what happens to industries over time. And you can relate that to exactly what's going on. And then of course that would be true for the transport ships versus containerization and other, someday containerization is going to be an antique technology. So it lets people kind of think about, how these things come and go and what role they play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's like a fascinating parallel in that whale oil, when it was no longer the primary source of lubrication for machinery, becomes an ingredient in a lot of other things. Like in the 20th century, it becomes part of cosmetics. It becomes the fat in margarine. And you think about oil today, a lot of oil companies have put their time and effort into making plastics and other things that maybe are not fuel as we traditionally think of it, but other markets for their products. So it is it's a really interesting kind of comparison. All right. Does anybody have any questions about what I talked about? Any other thoughts, concerns?
Maria, could you just go back to ship rig for a moment and talk a little bit about why on certain ships like the Amistad, the masts are as raked as they are, as opposed to being vertical?
Absolutely. The joke the Amistad crew makes is that it makes the boat look really fast, which it does. But it's actually a way to help a vessel point closer to the wind. So the Morgan's masts are actually raked too, but not nearly as obviously. And the aft mast, the mizzen mast, is more raked than the main and the fore. But basically by kind of the way that you move the mast back changes the shape of the sail. And it allows the vessel to basically trim their sails in to a different angle to point closer to the wind. A lot of modern racing boats will also have raked masts, but you'll see it instead of like a rake this way, it'll look like this. The mast will basically be bowed because the modern masts have more flex in them than the wooden masts in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it has to do with the tension on the sail too. And I guess another kind of basic distinction between fore and aft and square rigs is that fore and aft sails actually produce lift a lot like an airplane wing. So when you trim a fore and aft sail all the way in, it still has like a curve on the outside. And just like an airplane wing, that air has to move faster around the curve. And that creates that lift that actually not only pushes, but pulls a sailing vessel across the water. And a square rig sail, it has a little bit of lift, but predominantly it's that push force behind a square sail that is moving that vessel through the water. I am not the most eloquent in describing push-pull dynamics on a sail, but I do my best.
That's good.
Good.
There are some fascinating videos on the different ways you can maneuver a sail to create more or less lift. But.
The scientific term for what she's describing, if you want to look it up or look at a YouTube video so you can get a visual of what she's talking about, is called the Bernoulli effect or Bernoulli's principle. It's the same principle that allows an airplane to fly, like she said.
The Amistad's a very cool example because she is an 18th century vessel replica, or no, she's 19th century, but she's built early 19th century. And you can really see how different the Amistad is from the other ships that we have at the museum.
Wasn't there a period in steamships where they were blowing up and killing people all the time? I remember Cornelius Vanderbilt was an early sailing guy and then got into steamships. And I seem to remember that there was some issue during this early period where they literally, you were killing people with these, because they were trying to push the ship so hard or something. And that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. It was not like, it was not such a widespread issue that like every time you got on the steamship, you're like, maybe it'll explode, but it did happen. It had a lot to do with the quality of the construction of the engine. So iron and steel construction is evolving at this same time. And for a long time, there weren't quality standards on how thick it had to be or the structure of it or, what temperature it had to be heated and tempered to. So there were a lot of sort of faulty plates that were part of the boilers in these engines. And yes, they did explode.
And that's one of the reasons. I mean, even when you've got a well-built steam engine, it still takes tons of attention and constant care, be it monitoring the steam pressure, the water levels, the fire. And so, as Maria mentioned in one of her slides, diesel engines start becoming prevalent in the 1930s. And one of the huge reasons for that is that you could, once you get a diesel engine running, you can just let it go for a really long time with minimal oversight and correction. So it's definitely that's one of the main reasons that diesel kind of supplants steam as we go into the 20th century. It's just because lower operating costs, less skill, more safety.
Going back to a question about masts, what would happen if a mast would break?
Oh, great question. That happened a lot. You'll read a lot of stories in the newspapers about vessels that are dismasted. Most ships' masts are made of 3 parts. So let me, I'm going to very briefly share my screen again, just so you guys can see this. So if you look kind of closely at this picture of the Morgan, you can actually see where the mast overlaps about 2/3 of the way up, and then again at the very top. And so you have the lower mast, the topmast, and the topgallant mast.
So it's not one piece of wood; it's actually 3, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I don't know how to. Now I can't uncheck. There we go. Stop. So the easiest solution and the most common mast to break was that topgallant mast at the top. And some vessels actually had a 4th piece depending on how tall their masts were. So they would send all the rig down. And a lot of ships actually carried extra spars. So what they could do is they could actually just rig up a pulley system to pull that last piece of mast back up. And they're built to sort of overlap like this. So you have the mast below, the mast above. It's called a doubling. And what you can do is you can actually just kind of pull your new mast right up through and then attach it to the doubling. In a bigger issue, like if the main part of your mast comes down or most of your mast comes down, you could usually lash it sometimes. There's some instances of sailors basically splinting the mast and lashing it as a way to kind of limp into the nearest port for a replacement. By the 19th century, there are a lot of ports where you could get replacement parts fairly easily. But earlier in the 18th century, especially when people were traveling to West Coast and parts of South America that did not have sort of shipbuilding industry there or any kind of supplies, they would literally go and get a new piece of wood from the woods. And they would carry carpenters who were skilled enough to rebuild a mast. So one of the interesting issues when you start to transition to iron and steel ships is that there's this great concern that they're not going to be self-sufficient, because wooden vessels could carry a carpenter, and if your mast broke or if you hit something and you literally had a hole in your boat, they could careen the boat over in port and fix it. If you have an iron or steel ship, you don't necessarily have somebody who can make steel plating for you in in Buenos Aires, right? So you would not be able to fix your boat. So there was a lot of concern about not being able to replace these parts that were, generally speaking, they were sturdier, so they weren't going to break as often. But if you needed to replace them, you literally had to go all the way back to your port of construction to get a new piece.
In the hierarchy of the ship, for the crew, how high up is the ship's carpenter? He must be pretty high up.
Yeah, ship's carpenters were often they were the skilled sailors, so they were not required to stand watch, but they were not officers. So they were kind of in that in-between world between officers and your regular sailing hands. Okay. On the Morgan, if you go below, you'll see that they slept in steerage. So they were about on par with the harpooneers, who were also considered skilled men, although the carpenter did get away from the watch system. So unlike the harpooneers who still had to stand there 4-hour watches. but certainly a very important person to have on board.
So when we talk about steam, coal is the fuel of choice, and how did they refuel, and what's the range, which must evolve over time?
So early on, you had to carry all the fuel you needed to get there and sometimes to get back, which was not great because it meant that most of your cargo space was taken up with fuel. As time goes on, there's a concerted effort to build coaling stations all around the world. Interestingly, a lot of sailing ships are employed in carrying coal to coaling stations. Because sailing ships can sail with fewer crew members. You don't have to pay for fuel. They're big and they're cheap. You fill them up with coal. They sail out to the Pacific, and then they deposit the coal at the coaling station. One of the big reasons that America was super interested in Hawaii and other South Pacific islands was that in order to have their Navy in the Pacific, they needed to have coal and fueling stations. So they had to have some hold on an island or property in the Pacific. So that is a big, big part of trade out to Hawaii and other South Pacific islands. The Benjamin Packard, which is the cabin, it's a ship I showed in the slideshow, but it's the cabin is on the second floor of the Stillman building, was regularly employed from about 1890 until 1904-05, carrying coal out to Hawaii. All right. Sounds like I don't have any more questions, so it's a little early, but I also talk really fast, so I go through my presentations really quickly. If you have any questions that you think of, or again, if you're interested in any of these topics that we sort of touched on and you want to dig a little deeper, let me know. I can share with you some of our handbooks that we have here, or also some books that we have in our library that can give you a lot more information.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank
Very
you, guys.
helpful. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you. Enjoy
care.
the rainy day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.